Hello, my name is Tavonga, and welcome to the Government and Politics and Global Perspective video series. This is a project being done by final year students here at Africa University in Zimbabwe, where we're showcasing the relationship that governments have with the political structures that surround them. I will be taking you through military coups and Africa. Alright, so before we go anywhere far, we need to understand what a few key terms that will be used in this presentation mean. The 5 key terms that we'll be looking at are coup d'etat, state capture, elected government, unconstitutional actions, and the difference between a de jure and a de facto government. The first of these terms is a coup. A coup d'etat, also just known as a coup, is the seizure or overthrowing of a government that is in place. Typically, it is illegal and is done so by a political faction, a politician, a cult, a rebel group, the military, or a dictator. Many scholars have come to say that a coup is considered successful when the people doing the coup have taken power for a period longer than 7 days. The factors that lead to coups in Africa are as follows: military grievances, military popularity, economic decline, domestic political crisis, contagion from other regional groups, external threats, participation in war, collusion with foreign military power, colonial legacy, military size, strength of civil society, regime legitimacy, and past coups, among other factors. Now, coups have been found to appear in areas where coups have taken place. This is to say that a coup will beget another coup, and a coup will beget another coup. A number of the above listed factors are strongly related to military culture and power dynamics. These factors can be further simplified into the 2 following categories, right? There is a threat of military interests, and there is too much strength in the military. Now, if interests go in either direction, the military will either find itself supporting these actions or fighting to get power back from whoever's taking power over in these places. Now, research suggests that coups promoting democratization in authoritarian regimes become less likely to end up in a democracy. The international community tends to react adversely to coups by reducing international aid and imposing sanctions. A 2015 study finds that coups against democracy, coups after the Cold War, and coups in states heavily integrated into the national community are all more likely to elicit global reaction. Another 2015 study found that coups are the strongest predictor for the imposition of democratic sanctions, and a third study finds that Western states tend to react the strongest against coups that take place in less developed countries. Okay. The next key term that we need to understand is a state capture, right? So state capture refers to when the formal processes of government and bureaucracy are captured by individual parties that are not the government, who take interest in what the government does. These parties can be government officials, state-backed companies, or private individuals, and they do this to influence policies and laws in their favor. The state can be captured by the military, which inadvertently leads to a military coup, or it can be captured by any other party, which will force the military to intervene, which also inadvertently leads to a military coup in order to restore government to what it used to be, like what happened in Zimbabwe in 2017 under the alleged Operation Restore Legacy. The next important thing that we need to look at is an elected government. And to understand this, we need to break it down, look at a government, and then look at an election. A government is a system or a group of people that is typically responsible for running a certain area, which is normally a state. It can be split into 3 groups by its general understanding, which is the executive, the judiciary, and the legislation. The Columbia Encyclopedia defines government as a system of social control under which the right to make laws and the right to enforce them is vested in a particular group in society. In order to select a government, countries generally hold an election. An election is a formal group decision-making process by which a population chooses an individual or individuals to hold public office and govern them. Elections have been the usual mechanism by which modern representative democracy has operated since the 17th century. As such, an elected government is a group of people governing a state who the citizens of that state had selected. The existence of an elected government implies the existence of governments which are not elected, such as monarchies, dictatorships, or the one that comes from a military coup. Now, another key thing that we need to understand before we can fully conceptualize the relationship between military coups and governance in Africa is the concept of de jure and de facto governments. Now, a de jure government is one that is recognized by law to be the government in the state, and a de facto government is the one that in reality exercises and holds the political power in the state. Now, in a state that has a de jure government, we'll usually have that one strong government that is recognized by law and has the power at hand. But in a society and a state that has a de facto government, there will probably be two governments that are conflicting in this scenario. When it comes to joining bodies like the United Nations and being internationally recognized, a de jure government is the one that holds this privilege over a de facto government, because a de jure government is recognized by the law and can be a member of the United Nations, the African Union, ECOWAS, and any other regional groupings, which a de facto government is not able to do so. In a military coup, what often happens is a group amounts so much power that they become the de facto government of the day and they overthrow the de jure government. This leads to a problem whereby you have a state that is not recognized. Um, wait, a problem where you have a state whose government is not recognized by any other players in the system, which explains why the international community at large is often opposed to the idea of military coups and condemns the governments that rise in their wake. The final concept is that of unconstitutional actions. To understand what an unconstitutional action is, we first need to understand constitutionalism. At its basic, constitutionalism is the respect for the constitution, the respect for the rule of law. People in government cannot just act of their own will and exercise all the power that they have. They have to follow the constraints of the constitution, which limits how they can handle certain things and outlines the procedure in which certain things can be done. Now, unconstitutional actions are actions that disregard the constitution in stipulating the actions that can be done. For example, in taking power in a country. Taking a power via military coup is considered an unconstitutional action because the constitutions in many African states indicate that the only way to gain power is through a democratic election. This is why a lot of the governments that arise through this unconstitutional method of a coup are not recognized by their peers. However, it is a problem because we're seeing more and more of them practicing unconstitutionalism in a bid to save the democratic process, which is a bit of a dichotomy, which is a bit of a, imbalance in that regard. Now, some key theories that inform the relationship between military coups and governance in Africa are realism and the state of nature, in that those who have power will always seek to exercise their dominion over those who don't have power. And we see that in the military groups that take power forcibly and exercise that power over the people. A second one is Marxism, in that whenever in a society there are classes of people, those people will be at conflict. And that is seen by these revolutionary uprisings that lead to these military coups, in that the people are often subjugated and live in a very oppressive system, and this leads them to revolt and overthrow the governments that are in their way. Following infographic, we see some pretty alarming trends in Africa over the decades with military coups. That there's been a number of them starting early in the 60s and carrying forth even into these new decades. However, because of democratization processes, the number had started to decrease in the late 2010s, but it's very alarming that in the 2 years between 2020 and 2022, there's been almost the same number of coups as were in the entire decade of the 2010s. Interesting to note as well is that in the past 40 or so years, there have been more failed attempts at coups than those have been successful. Looking at this infographic, we find the most notorious members or the most notorious states when it comes to coups in Africa. The chief among the states in Africa with getting coups is Sudan, who has 16 military coups between 1952 and this date. Burundi has 11, Ghana and Sierra Leone are on 10, as well as Burkina Faso. Comoros on 9, Mali, Benin, and Nigeria with 8, Chad with 7. Case studies. Mali 2020. Protests in Mali had been going on since 5 June, with protesters calling for the resignation of President Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta. Protesters were displeased with the government's management of the ongoing insurgency, alleged government corruption, and the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, as well as a deteriorating economy. On August 18th, elements of the Malian armed forces began a mutiny. Soldiers on pickup trucks stormed this town of Kati, where gunfire was exchanged before weapons were distributed from the armory and senior officers were arrested. Tanks and armored vehicles were seen on the town streets, as well as military trucks heading for the capital of Bamako. The soldiers detained several government officials, including President Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta, who resigned and dissolved the government. This was the country's second coup in less than 10 years, following the one in 2012. 5 colonels appeared on the TV broadcast to the nation, led by Colonel Assami Goïta. They called themselves the National Committee for the Salvation of the People, and they stressed that no casualties had been suffered throughout the entire process. However, 4 died and 15 were reported to be seriously injured by officials from the main hospital in the region. On the 12th of September 2020, this committee agreed to an 18-month political transition to civilian rule. The African Union, European Union, and United Nations all condemned the coup. Niger 2021. The 2021 coup d'etat attempt in Niger occurred on the 31st of March around 3 a.m. after gunfire erupted from the streets of Niamey, the capital of Niger, 2 days before the inauguration of the president-elect Mohamed Bazoum. This coup attempt was staged by elements within the military and was attributed to an Air Force-based unit in the area near the Niamey airport. The alleged leader of the plot was Captain Sani Saleh Goruza, who was in charge of security at the unit's base. After the coup attempt was foiled, the perpetrators were arrested. In addition, the coup d'etat tried to occur during a peaceful transition between 2 democratically elected presidents, a context unprecedented in Niger. The swearing in of the new president Mohamed Bazoum would occur 2 days after the attempted coup. However, the defeated opponent and ex-president Mahaman Usman contested the election results and lodged a legal appeal with the Constitutional Court, which was rejected. Nigerian President Muhammadu Buhari described the act as naive and old-fashioned. The president of the African Union and the Economic Community of West African States condemned the attempted coup, a sentiment which was also echoed by other African countries, including Chad and Algeria. Zimbabwe 2017. In November 2017, Zimbabwean President Robert Mugabe was removed as president and party leader of ZANU-PF and was replaced by Emerson Dambudzo Mnangagwa. On the evening of 14 November 2017, elements of the Zimbabwe Defense Forces gathered around Harare, the capital of Zimbabwe, and seized control of the Zimbabwe Broadcasting Corporation and key areas of the city. The next day, the ZDF issued a statement saying that it was not a coup d'etat and that President Mugabe was safe, although the situation would return to normal after the ZDF had dealt with the criminals around the president at the time. These criminals were the ones who were believed to be responsible for the socio-economic problems in Zimbabwe. On November 19th, ZANU-PF removed Mugabe as party leader, replacing him with Mnangagwa, and issued a deadline of 20 November for Mugabe to resign from the presidency. Mugabe did not resign, and so on 21 November, a joint session of parliament met for his impeachment. After the session convened, Mugabe sent a letter to Zimbabwe's parliament resigning the presidency. Second Vice President Phelekezela Mpopo became the acting president, and Mnangagwa was sworn in as the president of the country on 24 November 2017. Chad 2021. In the 2021 Chadian presidential election, President Idriss Déby, who seized power in the 1919 coup d'etat, was widely expected to maintain power and increase his 30-year reign in the country. Déby won all but one of the departments in the country. In not recognizing the result, the opposition had called to boycott the 11 April election, with the Reform Party refusing to concede victory to Déby. Preliminary results showed on 21st April that Déby had won by a landslide 79.3% of the electorate. A military offensive in northern Chad, initiated by the Chadian rebel group Front for Change and Concord in Chad, took place from 11 April to 9 May 2021 in the aftermath of the election. President Idriss Déby was killed during this offensive, and on 20 April 2021, his son, Mahamat Déby, became acting president of Chad. This coup is considered a dynastic coup because even though it led to a leader being deposed, that leader was replaced by his very son, similarly mirroring what happens in a monarchy. On April 22, 2021, France publicly defended the military takeover of the government by Déby's son, despite it being unconstitutional, by saying that it was under extremely exceptional circumstances. Burkina Faso 2022. A coup d'etat was launched in Burkina Faso on the 23rd of January 2022. Gunfire erupted in front of the presidential residence in the capital and several military barracks around the city. Soldiers were reported to have seized control of the military base that was contained in the capital. However, the government denied that there was an ongoing coup in the country. Several hours later, President Roch-Marc Christian Kabore was reported to have been detained by soldiers at the military camp in the capital. On 24 January, the military announced on television that Kabore had been deposed from his position as president. After the announcement, the military declared that the parliament, government, and constitution had all been dissolved. The coup d'etat was led by military officer Paul Henry Sandaogo Dambia. As a result of this, in September of the very same year, another coup took place in Burkina Faso. This coup removed interim president Paul Henry Sandaogo Dambia over his alleged inability to deal with the country's Islamic insurgency. Dambia had come to power in a coup d'etat just 8 months earlier. Captain Ibrahim Traore took over as interim leader. This showed that clearly a coup will beget another coup. So ultimately, we come to find that Africa has bad experience with democracy, and that's why we experience a lot of coups. The first issue with democracy in Africa is that it was and still is a colonial tool that was imposed on the majority of the states as part of the package of independence. And independence that up to date can be contested its validity. Was it actual independence or it was ceremonial in just letting people go and letting them stop fighting? Therefore, there is great need for Africans to decide whether or not democracy is the way in which they can make their independence a reality. One of the reasons why democracy has failed greatly is because it was imposed on leaders who did not understand, respect, or appreciate the dictates of a true democracy. At the conception of democracy, African states were too poor, too culturally fragmented, and insufficiently capitalist. Party systems was something fairly new in Africa, which was traditionally monarchical in nature. As such, those who were instrumental in the liberation struggle feel entitled to power the same way a prince feels entitled to the throne. This is a common theme in most African states, where the ruling party is the one that reigns supreme after independence. Hence, they often thwart and stifle opposition parties. This oppressive relationship leads to revolt, and the most common type of revolution in Africa is a coup d'etat. Thank you. And now we're gathering some community perceptions on military coups in Africa. Joined by my first guest here. I've got a couple questions for you. The first is, how do you feel about the increasing number of military coups in Africa?
Naturally, the perception is to feel like violence should not be the thing that people resort to. But if you look closely at the type of leaders that these military takeovers are dealing with, you see that it tends to be justified. Of course, well, when you want to look at humanity and the casualties that need to come involved, then yeah, there's some desire to feel like it's not justified. But again, I'll go back to the people in question, the kind of leaders that they're trying to remove. If you look at them and the way that they behave, how they even abuse the powers that they have or the military at their disposal, you find that at times it is a justified reflex to get rid of these kind of leaders that we have in Africa.
I think coups have a ripple effect on each other. the moment there are terrible conditions within one African nation and military involvement within that nation actually spearheads some sort of resolution, it's bound to spear or spill into the next nation. So it is a good and bad thing, however, bad on the fact that it does infringe on human rights. We have lives lost in the process. We have we have economies plunging, we have social healthcare systems and everything just going downhill. So I mean that is the negative side of Coups, but I think it's very good for there to be some sort of realization of what democracy actually is. And for people to see whether they're living under an authoritarian rule or just something merely a facade of political activism.
I'm not quite happy about the number of military coups in the world, in particular to Africa, because this symbolizes the instability of our democratic practices as a whole, as a continent in particular. Because you look at Nigeria, it has had over 3 coups since its attainment of independence, and it's one of the biggest countries in Africa. Now, what does this say about smaller states in Africa? What does this say to Zimbabwe? What does this say to the regional dynamics of power politics and the structures of integration as a whole? Because we have to understand one thing: when we have a military coup, it's sort of a downgrade to democracy as a whole. And now, with the rising trend of globalization, this trend is likely to spread. It starts in Nigeria, it starts in West Africa, then it comes to Southern Africa, and it spreads to other countries as well.
Okay, so do you think that a coup is a necessary part in the democratic process, based off what you just answered?
Not necessary per se. I think it's a yes and no actually. Yes, in the fact that looking at Africa, we inherited a colonial structure for politics. We claim the administrative system we've been given is purely democratic, but it's not something we actually got to figure out or build for ourselves. So within that process of establishing what's right, what's wrong within the political field, I think coups are necessary and also bring about some sort of realization within the nations at large of what's going on within the political arena.
Okay. With regards to these coups, do you think that they carry the citizen interest at heart, or it's some other
No,
something else driving
not
these
at
coups?
all. I think they don't carry the citizens' interests at heart, because more often than not, military coups have nothing to do with the citizens. They usually have something to do with power politics in the country.
Yes and no. It's very important to look at the scenarios surrounding the coup. You find that there are different things that lead to these kinds of coups, but you find that in some instances you actually have the citizens rejoicing that this tyrant has been removed, this dictator has been removed because of the conditions that are prevailing in the state at the time.
Initially, they are supposed to, but one thing about power is it's very addictive. So the moment people realize how good power is, or to be within those political leadership places is, eventually it changes the mind. So we see military forces advancing with the people's needs at first, because I mean they're also part of the civilians. They get paid, they see their wages getting cut, and it pushes them to fight for some sort of reform. However, when they get to the top, they are bound to make some political mistakes. They are bound to be susceptible to corruption and land deals and stealing and everything. So initially it does start with the citizens' interest at heart, but it's bound to change if the system is also not one of checks and balances.
Okay. And just lastly, in your opinion, do you think that governance improves or worsens in the aftermath of a military coup?
It will definitely worsen because it's a new norm that people need to readjust to before it gets better. So while the military is in power or have assumed the new government, they will have some certain things that they will have to change, policies that they have to mitigate before things fall into place eventually. So there will be a few uprisings as people adjust to the new norm, because change is hard to accept.
Baby steps. In that state, it's bound to worsen before it gets better. So, like everything, you need to give it time.
Well, now that's subjective. I would give the example of Zimbabwe. I would say, in my opinion, as a citizen or governance has become better since the absence of the man himself. But at the same time, that's not to say he had poor leadership in Africa or poor leadership in Zimbabwe. But I think it's dependent upon how the nation recovers from that military coup per se, or whatever has happened in that transition to power. Because you look at the aspect of elections per se. After a coup, are there elections after? If they do happen to have elections after, now can you call it a military coup, or is it just a coup, or is it even democracy? That begs the question.
Thank you. Valuable insights.
Sure.
So the community generally believes that these coups can be a good thing, but also are a bad thing, because they're a good thing in that the coups are happening for a reason. There's economic instability, there's political instability, there's a tyrant in power that needs to be addressed. But they're bad because of the violence and they lead to more instability than what they aim to fix in the first place. So this is that dynamic that exists in the community perceptions regarding to military coups. So ultimately, the emergence and the prevalence of military coups in Africa is very telling. It's telling of one thing that I think in particular, that is, Africa was not meant for the model of government that it's using right now. If you look into the history of Africa, there were monarchical states, there were kingdoms and chiefdoms that were running the show in Africa, those independent states that existed before colonization and before the scramble for Africa, and Africa was divided into the states that we know today. These were run by chiefs and kings and queens who exercised conquest as a means to get power. That is what we see in these modern African states, that the power rests within the military because the military is the one that is capable of providing a conquest. And he who owns the military owns the power in Africa. That is why every time a government falls out of favor, especially with key members of the military, there is a coup. A coup as a conquest in order to restore power and restore the balance into the hands of the people that have the power, which is the military power. So you find that if you take a system that is built upon conquest and you break it away from conquest, it will go back to conquest because conquest is in its DNA. Conquest is in the DNA of the African leader, the African politician, the African man with power is known as a man who has conquest, who has captured and who has taken control. And the idea of holding a democratic election and convincing people and letting them vote does not quite portray that idea of power being something that is taken through means of a conquest. And because of that, military coups are very prevalent in Africa and they don't seem to be going anywhere because military power and conquest is what is power. That's why we find de jure governments are replaced by de facto governments because these de facto governments have that military power, have that conquest, and that ability to take the power and lead the people. That is why Africa always has military coups. So I think just throwing it out there, would it be a bad idea to take Africa back to its stage of kingdoms, to take it back to kings and queens and chiefs and let them rule? Because that is what our history did. That is what our ancestors did before people came and they changed the way we lived our lives. We lived in kingdoms with chiefs who had to prove that they could lead by means of conquest. The same means of conquest that we find these people who claim to be in a democratic institution giving us today.